Alright, today our area of study will be Acts chapter 7, verses 9 through 19. We will also look at some of Genesis 37 and 39 specifically. So we're going to dive in with Acts. And the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. Remember, this is Stephen talking. But God was with him and rescued him out of all his afflictions, gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. Now there came a famine throughout all of Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers on their first visit. And on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. And Joseph sent and summoned Jacob his father and all his kindred, 75 persons in all. Verse 15. And Jacob went down into Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers, and they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. 17 says, But as the time of the promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, until there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph. He dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants so that they would not be kept alive. So, last week we looked at this man Abraham, we looked at Jacob, and we looked at Isaac, the patriarchs. We saw them as examples of just faith. We see their tremendous amount of faith in God. We also see that they're human, they make mistakes. In fact, we saw Abraham and Isaac make the very same mistake by having their wives pretend to be their sisters in Egypt. And we just see, with specifically Jacob, I want to go into a little bit of their history, where Joseph comes from. Jacob married Rachel, as we know. He married Rachel and Leah. Of course, he was swindled into marrying Leah. He truly loved Rachel, didn't really love Leah. So a common theme with the wives of the patriarchs was barrenness. We saw that with Abraham and Sarah, where Sarah was barren, it says in Genesis 11. It says Sarah was barren and had no son. Then Genesis 16, we saw her try to take things into her own hands by giving her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abraham. We saw how well that ended up. And then we looked at Rebekah. It says Rebekah was also barren, as Genesis 24:21 says. And Isaac prayed for his wife Rebekah, and she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and she conceived. Genesis 29:31 says, when the Lord saw that Leah was hated. So this was, now we're talking about with Jacob. Jacob, it says, Leah was hated. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Then in 30 verse 22 it says, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. 23, she conceived a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. Then in Genesis chapter 35 verse 16 it would say that Rachel went into labor with a second son, and it was a hard labor. She would give birth to another son, Benjamin, and would die in the process. So now Jacob has lost his favorite wife, and he has two sons. He has Joseph, and we see Benjamin. And this son Joseph, we will see a little bit later, was Jacob's favorite. He treated Joseph way better than he treated his other sons, and we see that led way to jealousy. In fact, we'll see a little later on that it would cause the brothers to hate Joseph so much that they would try to kill him, or plot to kill him. So we see that in Genesis 37. I'll start reading that a little bit. It talks about how Jacob lived in the land. This is 37 verse 1. Jacob lived in the land of his fathers, sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. It talks about Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. He made him a robe of many colors, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all the other brothers. They hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And he said to them, so basically, I'll summarize those dreams. It basically says that his brothers will bow down to him, which does in fact happen, as we'll see later on. So we pick up in verse 12. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flocks at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, Here I am. And he said to him, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked, What are you seeking? I am seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, They have gone away, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill a fierce animal. Let us kill him and throw him into one of these pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, Let us not take his life here in the wilderness, but let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. And then a little while later, it says that Ishmaelite traders would come along and they would sell Joseph to them. So these brothers want to kill Joseph, but Reuben, the eldest brother, says, No, we're not going to do that. Just leave him in the pit. And Reuben had a plan. He was going to try to rescue this brother, Joseph, the 17-year-old boy they throw in a pit. Now, Reuben will also see in Genesis chapter 35 that Reuben would go into one of his father Jacob's concubines. And we'll see that during the blessing part, Jacob will say, You will, let's see, it's chapter 49, that Reuben would have that Genesis 49:3 says that Reuben would have no preeminence. So maybe he wanted to save Joseph to try to get back into his father's good graces, or who knows why. It could be for good reasons, but Reuben tries to save him. Doesn't work. They sell him into slavery for 20 shekels of silver, which would come out to about 22 ounces of silver for every one of the brothers, which is not a lot for your cost of your brother. And this young man is taken to Egypt, 17-year-old boy. And we see in chapter 39, we pick back up. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of the Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Verse 4. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him, and he made him an overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him an overseer in the house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. Because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. So we see this man Joseph, this boy, has made it to Egypt, was bought as a slave by this man Potiphar. He was the captain of the guard, so in charge of the prisons and stuff. Powerful man for sure. And he puts, in a little bit of time, puts Joseph in charge of everything. Joseph has gained trust and power, and God has blessed it. He had integrity, as we'll look at real quick. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by the garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left her garment and fled, left his garment in her hand and fled, and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said, "See, he has brought among us," this is talking about Potiphar, "a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice, and when he heard that, he fled and got up out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to laugh at me, but as soon as I lifted up my voice, he cried and left his garment and fled the house." And when Potiphar had heard these words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him, put him into the prison, place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So before long, he's in charge of the entire prison. So very interesting thing. I've heard a couple theologians, including one of my pastors, say this, but it's very likely that Potiphar himself knew that his wife was probably not extremely happy where she was. This man was probably a eunuch. So when this whole story happens, he gets angry, but a lot of theologians think that he actually got angry with his wife and he had to act on it. He's a person high standing in Egypt, so he had to act on it. So what he does, Potiphar brings him into his prison. Again, it says right there, the captain of the guard. He's the captain of the guard, and it says the captain of the guard put him in charge of the prison. So he now has Joseph helping with the prison. Instead of getting Joseph into a terrible situation, God says, "Okay, you were loyal and faithful and had integrity, and now I'm going to bless you even in a prison." Through this same man Potiphar, very likely. It's just a really cool thing. It shows that Joseph was able to. This probably was a tough temptation. This man, Potiphar, was probably rich and probably had a beautiful wife, and Joseph was, it says, a good-looking guy. So he's one of three people that the Bible says that about. We see that David and David's sons Absalom, the only guys that God would call handsome. So Joseph's a good-looking guy. He's probably about 25 at the time, something like that, and he refuses. He runs. He flees from temptation. This man Joseph is such a good picture for us. He's one of the few people in the Bible that we see nothing bad written about him. He was truly a type of Christ. This was an image of the coming Christ. Just the way Joseph lived his life, the way he was used by God, and if anyone had a right to misbehave and blame it on his raising, it would be him. He had his brothers hate him and try to kill him and sold him into slavery. Then he's wrongfully accused, and we see so many terrible things happen to him. And instead of him playing the victim and making a mess of his life, he says, "No, I'm going to put my faith in God." And he says, flees from temptation, flees from that temptation. I think it's safe to assume that out of anyone, that's a person who I want to model my life after. Someone who truly flees those temptations. And so he interprets two men's dreams. That would be the cupbearer and the baker. And he completely predicts them. And these two men, he says one will die and one will get power with Pharaoh, be back in his position. And this comes to pass, and Joseph says, "Hey, remember me. Tell what I said to you, to Pharaoh." but the guy forgets, and after a while, Pharaoh starts having this dream, and he's terrified. He can't have any. No one can tell him what it means. And the man who Joseph interprets his dreams says to him, "Hey, I had a guy interpret my dreams." So he brings Joseph. They get Joseph all ready to go. Bring him to the Pharaoh, and he interprets the Pharaoh's dreams. It predicts 7 years of great wealth and then 7 years of famine. Like 7 years of more food and everything than they've ever had, and then it would be 7 years of famine, worse than ever before. And Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of everything, and then we see Joseph handled it incredibly wisely through God, and God gives him success. And then we see a little while later that his brothers are starving. His family's starving because there's no food. So they go to Egypt, where they heard. It says it in Acts again. It says, "But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers on the first visit. In the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh." So we see Joseph recognizes his brothers, treats them harshly, gives them enough grain, but also lets them keep their money, sends them away. They came back to return the money, and Joseph ends up taking one of them captive to bring back Benjamin. And anyway, we just see all that, and then we see him at the last time reveal himself to his brothers, weeping. They didn't recognize this man, Joseph. He was probably had these Egyptian garments, probably had the same Egyptian everything. He transformed a little bit, and he speaks to them in Hebrew. He speaks to a translator at first, and then at the end he'll speak to them in Hebrew and say, "I'm your brother Joseph." And anyway, the amazing reunion. He'll get to live with his father, see with his father again, Jacob, who thought his son was dead because of this. I remember that these brothers, brought back Joseph's coat of many colors, as it's called, and soaked it in blood. And remember, Joseph traveled 16 to 20 miles. Dothan is about 16 to 20 miles north of where they lived. So I always had assumed that this would be like in their backyard, in one of their fields that it happened, but no, that was 20 miles away. They said they put blood on the garment and said that a beast had eaten him. And anyway, so this man, Jacob, is probably like, "I'm never going to see my son again." And then he gets to see his son again, which is just an amazing picture. He gets to die in Egypt with his son Joseph, and it says they laid him in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver. And then, but as the time of promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, until someone rose up, another Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. He dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our pharaohs to expose their infants so that they would not be kept alive. So we see this testimony of this man Joseph. Above reproach, he is someone who we can all look at. He fled temptation. He said no, and God used him in just tremendous ways. It's just truly incredible. Someone who, again, had all the right to complain and play the victim and say, "Woe is me," said, "No, I'm not going to be like that." He's going to make the most of his situation wherever he's at. He's going to flee temptation. He's going to have integrity. He's going to be this type of Christ, this picture of the coming Christ, of someone who truly lived differently. That's how I want to live, and that's how I know it says in Paul in Philippians would say, "Look at me, look at my life, try to copy me, take after me in my testimony." It's the same thing with Joseph. I think of this man, and he's a life that I truly want to mold my life to be like. So then there's a Pharaoh, and Joseph was the second most powerful person in all of Egypt, only under the Pharaoh. And then the next Pharaoh, or a couple of pharaohs later, forgets about Joseph. He did not know who Joseph was, so he dealt shrewdly with the Hebrews and forced our fathers to expose their infants so that we would not be kept alive. So then we see this. It gets a whole different picture. This gets a lot different of a mood. He dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants. We know this was the start of this persecution to this Israel nation. They're going to be in bondage for 300 years and under this Egyptian nation, and they're going to be slaves. And then they're going to have their kids, their newborn sons, would have to be killed. All the newborn sons, because they didn't want the Hebrew nation, the Israelites, to grow stronger. And we will see next week. We'll look at one of the sons. His parents had enough faith in God to keep his son alive, and God will use that little boy in a huge way. And we'll look at that next week. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Remember that, man. Just we have people we can look up to, and I say we do that. Like, look at this man like Joseph. Look at a man like Paul and their testimonies, and try to live like that. Try to live above reproach. As hard as that is, continue to flee temptations. It's something that we need to do. And it's something that's incredibly difficult. And it's something that we're never going to be perfect at doing. We're always going to sin. We're always going to have flaws. But if we continue with God, in God's hands, in God's presence, God will take us and He will carry us exactly where we need to be. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next week.